They laughed at her in the mall. They filmed it. They commented on it. They applauded the embarrassment. What no one there knew was that that black woman wasn't alone. She was the wife of a man who never forgave public mistakes. And he was watching everything. They humiliated a black woman at the mall, without knowing she was the wife of a mafia boss. The sound of luxury Christmas music folded into a cleaner, colder noise, a sharp heel striking a rib. For a second, the melody and the impact were the same kind of puncture, bright, public, impossible to ignore. Amara's hand hit marble. Glass glittered like broken stars. A white dress that had cost more than her first car lay in a scatter of satin and sequins around her. Someone shouted. Phones lifted like a forest of lighthouses, capturing the slow, humiliating frame of a woman folding to the floor. Marcus Wellington stood over her with a smile that had been practiced a dozen times in front of hotel mirrors. He had the air of a man who expected to be forgiven for anything because his name was always enough to smooth a ridge in the world. Jessica Chong clutched her purse and laughed the exact laugh of someone who learned early to perform allegiance to pedigree. Mr. Wellington watched from an adjacent display booth, eyes politely vacant, the sort of man who kept moral outrage in tidy sleeves. Amara tasted copper. It wasn't dramatic, no movie blood, no instant collapse, but the scent of it was acutely private in the middle of the mall's holiday rush. Her fingers, pressed to her side, trembled. The seam of her coat had burst open in a way that felt like the world had decided to take something and leave something else. A torn hem here, a small bruise, perhaps, a photograph on half a dozen feeds by the time her hand left the marble. "Watch where you're going," Marcus said, which is to say he wanted the scandal to read like an accident. His voice carried the same cadence he'd used the night he left her apartment with a suitcase and her savings, the same thin courtesy that had deputized everyone's silence. There was a ripple through the crowd that had less to do with him and more to do with enjoying the view. Nobody moved forward to help. A woman adjusted her scarf and stepped around the fallen hem as if it were a puddle. Someone muttered about cameras. For an hour that might have been half a day, Amara felt strangely removed from her own body, watching herself through a pane, her heels still in the wrong rhythm, shopper's breath clouding the storefront glass like small votive lights. The sound of the heel, over and over, returning to her like a recurring chorus. Her phone, pressed to the polished marble by chance when she'd hit the ground, blinked awake with one name across the screen. Kang Min-jun. His name appearing felt like a warm, impossible shore. For months, the sight of it had been her private sanity, the letters on a screen that meant someone always knew where she was, that there were people in motion because of her. The irony was that strangers now had a clearer look at her than she did. Their phones caught angles she hadn't known could be seen. Marcus bent closer as if he could read the name, as if that detail would stitch his contempt into narrative. "Who's he?" Jessica's voice was a small dagger. Another phone tried for better light. Amara felt the world tilt. She could have lied. She could have swallowed the word that would send Marcus backing up, could have raised her chin and told him there were consequences he hadn't accounted for. But she also knew that tonight, when the shops were lit and families strung like pearls on benches, she was tired of being smaller for other people's comfort. She kept her mouth closed. She let the phone vibrate, let the caller ID breathe. The call came through. Kang Min-jun's voice, slow, the kind of evenness that belonged to a man who had trained himself to turn down heat so other people didn't feel it, said first in Korean, low and unflappable, "Ne apasa? Are you hurt?" The translation was a soft thing in her head. His question was methodical the way a physician's is, a measurement before action. Amara answered without thinking, "I'm okay." She lied, which was not the same as untrue. She was okay enough to stand, but coming to terms with the sensation of being watched would take longer than a subway ride. "Stay, don't move, tell me exactly where you are," he said, and his voice found its way through a murmur of marble and faux-tushed laughter to a man who would never be caught by surprise without it being part of an arrangement. "I'm on my way." Marcus, overhearing, gave a theatrical shake of amusement. "Oh, your boyfriend's going to... what's he? A bodyguard? An interpreter? A lover?" He said lover like a word with edges. He thought he was insulting a nobody by imagining the man who would come for her as absurdly domestic. He did not understand how insult could fold into a different currency when used on the wrong ledger.
It didn't dawn on Marcus that the boyfriend, as he called him, could rewrite the ledger. Security arrived because a store manager had finally decided to perform civil concern. The older guard's fingers hovered above a radio, unsure whether to play hero or mediator. The cameras watched with a mercy that was only superficially humane. Their lenses recorded history like vultures with soft lenses. Amara let the security guard's arms support her. The pressure was enough to keep her upright and not to lock her into gratitude. People circled like moths, whispering their versions of what they'd seen. Someone had already posted a clip. Another had already sent it to a friend with a laughing emoji. "She's shopped here before," said someone beside the dessert kiosk, as if that fact proved something about entitlement or the lack of it.
The sentence was small and cruel, the kind of removal that takes away a person by making them a pattern. Amara breathed, and while everyone else leaned into the entertainment of her misstep, she let memory do what it always did, slide in like a film strip, sometimes violent, sometimes quiet. The mall dissolved, and in its place were cold plastic seats and a station wagon's heater that didn't work. 3 years earlier, she counted $17 in an envelope and a hospital bracelet that had grown loose around a wrist no one would later call their own. She had learned then how the world could collapse not in dramatic acts, but in a long series of small, exacting absences. The day Marcus took the money that had been in her first month's pay, the day he told her it would all be different tomorrow, the winter nights she held herself in a car and pretended not to be alone until the sun came up and she could pretend there were other people in the city. There was no single explosive wound in that past, no one scene to point to as origin. There were 100 quiet betrayals, an ex-fiancé who made the right noises, who could speak pleasantly at their daughter's prenatal ultrasound appointment and then disappear when the walls around her apartment would not stand. There was his talent for erasing debt with a chorus of charitable lives. There were nights she stood on a fire escape in a city that does not pause for grief and made lists of everything she could ever live without, the coat, the curtains, even the memory of his laugh. She had learned, outside of romance novels, how to rebuild. She had become someone who could rebuild on the back of a community of small mercies, a neighbor who let her use a shower, a teacher who paid for art supplies out of a pocket, a friend who taught her how to iron a collar so that even on an empty stomach, she looked like a woman with a future. Teaching steadied her. The children in her classroom asked the right kind of questions. How do you spell phoenix? How do you pick up a broken thing and decide it's not finished? And she learned all over again that language could make survival an act of intention, not just a default setting. Marcus had been a professional at smoothing edges. He'd been different with the public than he had been in their private life. He was a man who could charm a gallery owner and then leave a woman with nothing if it served his comfort. When he left the kind of silence that screams. No forwarding address, no apology, just an evaporation of promises. He had been the man who taught her what it meant to have a past that could be stolen. Between theft and rebuilding, Amara learned a stubbornness that looked a lot like dignity. It wasn't sudden. It was the quiet accumulation of slightly better days, a repaired kitchen faucet, a certificate on the wall, her own small apartment with a lamp on a side table.
It was the Kathleen Turner of Southern kind, stylish, composed, not a trophy, but a person who took in light on purpose. Then Minjun found her. He had been a surprise, not because he was dangerous, he carried danger like a shadow under a coat, but because he entered her life with a civility that made belligerence obsolete. He had the practiced calm of a man who had learned to use presence as polity. They met at a charity event. Amara was there to read for a school fundraiser, Minjun to write a check with a signature that compacts futures. He watched her with an attention that did not ask anything from her story. It sat quiet, and then asked permission to stay. He wasn't theatrical about love. He wrote poems that could have been emails. He folded tenderness into meals, into the quiet pledge of his time. He asked about the things she had kept on her nightstand. He learned the names of her teachers in the city she had come from. She married him not because his name opened doors she couldn't have opened herself, but because the safety he offered felt like a choice rather than a sewn-up destiny. She tasted permission around him, permission to keep her own money, to go to the market at dusk, to be angry without apology. He had guards, because life as he moved through it required them. But they were not theatrical guards with mirrored sunglasses at all hours. Jean Wu and Tai Yang were precise and almost invisible, the kind of professionals who could fold into a restaurant without making the table feel less ordinary. Minjun insisted on them because it was not indulgence but stewardship. He had a ledger, and she knew that if it came to tallying costs, he would write her name in a column of things he would not tolerate.
"Promise me you'll never go alone to places where you feel exposed," he would say, his accent soft but his meaning ironed flat. "Not because I don't trust you, because I don't trust people who look at you like you are a possession." Amara sometimes felt suffocated by his worry. She had lived through abandonment and poverty, and independence had its own weight. She wanted now and then to do grocery shopping at noon and stand in line like other women who had not been taught to be careful. That insistence was how Marcus had once taken advantage of her, by making her believe that needing help was a defect. With Minjun, needing help was returned with a banked steadiness that did not try to erase her agency. The tension between them was not only in power, it was also in grace. He could keep her safe, and she could refuse a palanquin. That evening, in the mall, on a night lit with fake snow and wreaths meant to make the city feel like a kind lot, she had gone in spite of his warning, because she wanted to pick up a fabric swatch for a project she had in mind for a community fundraiser. It was a small rebellion, choosing to be public and yet plain.
She had texted Keisha, who lived in Atlanta now, and loved to supply pep talk emojis and contradictory fashion advice. "You got this," she had typed. She would be back before dinner. She told Minjun she would be back before dinner. She had not known Marcus would be there. She had not expected the precise scale of humiliation to be performed like an event. She had not expected that his circle would choose to make her fall at the fulcrum of their conversation. Now, with warmth from 1,000 screens, the scene had become a small theater. Marcus's mockery was a blunt instrument aimed at her past, and the audience held up cards to indicate they were in favor. People always like spectacles that end with shame. Their hearts feel trained to lean into moral tidy-ups. The mall smelled like roasted chestnuts and perfume, and the metallic tang that clung to Amara's tongue. Minjun's arrival, when it came, didn't look like an arrival. He moved through traffic with a calm that made the cars around him yield, not out of terror, but because his presence filled space like a tide. His coat brushed a shoulder. A bodyguard in an understated suit slid up beside him, the man with the quiet hands, Jin Woo. Taeyang followed a moment behind, careful and watchful like smoke that never gets close enough to burn. By the time he stepped into the atrium, the social geometry had already shifted. People had begun to understand there was an element of ownership they had miscalculated. Phones searched for the story's next beat, the arrival of the boyfriend. Marcus's smile wavered because his confidence had been predicated on a cost-free performance of contempt. Someone had leaked the wrong script. Minjun's entrance did not scream. He didn't step into a spotlight. He moved as if he had always been here, as if this mall had been another room of his house. Yet when he looked at Amara, at the slight folding of her shoulders, at the way she tried to right the hem of her skirt like a private prayer, something in the crowd's appetite thinned. Marcus's rallying cheer faltered. The guards who had been there to keep peace now seemed to understand that they had walked into a fissure. A store manager muttered words into his radio as if he could put a bandage on the architecture of shame. Minjun said one name into his phone before he came across the marble, Amara. The way he said it made people fold inward. It was not possessive. It was not possessive because there was no need to mark. It was reverence that had been forged in the long arc of someone who knew what it meant to be both public and hunted. Amara did not stand to perform anything for him. She did not look to him to extract her. She lifted her chin because she had been practicing that lift for years. But seeing him there, the quiet rip of his coat, the shadow of Jin and Taeyang behind him, an odd orchestration of armor and civility, she let herself lean into the idea that she could be kept without being controlled.
Minjun's eyes took in Marcus in a second and catalogued him in a way that looked like calculation rather than fury. He took in Jessica's perfume and the way Mr. Wellington tried to appear benign. He noted how many phones were out. His mouth tightened once, the line not unlike a decision being made at the speed of a thought. He did not stride across the floor with the intent to hurt. He moved like someone who had evaluated the cost of every possible way forward. "Jean," he said once, and Jean slid to the edge of the small knot of people, a professional who could vanish into the background or occupy it with a single gesture. "Taeyang, be discreet. Do not make a scene." The word was almost gentle, but the phrase, "do not make a scene," was not kind to Marcus when he repeated it under his breath. He had structured his humiliation like a public ritual. Now an unknown step had been placed in it, restraint. Marcus had expected the spectacle to conclude with clucking and a viral clip, and maybe a pat on the back from his father. He had not expected the arrival of a man who measured impact in ways that had nothing to do with Twitter. A guard approached to make sure no one had legally overstepped lines. Marcus, still in performance mode, offered a statement. "She colliding with our display, it was entirely an accident." His voice sought plausible deniability. People like Marcus live on plausible deniability. Amara let the guard's gloved hand rest on her elbow and then peel away, as if she had been anchored and now was being untied. Minjin stayed close enough to be a presence, not a hurricane. "If you're hurt, we can go," Minjin said, speaking to the security guard through a translation advantage, his Korean laced with the international cadence that concealed an intelligence used to buying minute pleasures for enormous stakes. His tone put the guard and Marcus and Jessica into the soft geometry of a man asking for facts while holding the rest in reserve. Marcus smiled, and for a second it read like a dare. "We were just discussing the store's collection," he said. "There's nothing—" Minjin's hand settled briefly on Amara's shoulder, then left. Fingers like that are small governance, the placement of a touch and its removal announcing both cover and courtesy. He didn't speak harshly. He didn't need to. A little later, in the flurry of people who wanted to claim they had done the decent thing first, Amara found herself sitting on a bench behind a fountain, her coat still ripped, a small smear of blood on the cuff. Minjin knelt in front of her, attending to the damage not like an owner, but like someone who had been taught to hold dangerous things with a soft glove. He asked her if she wanted to go to the infirmary. She said no. She did not want to dramatize the wound. "Do you want me to talk to them?" he asked. Amara looked at him. The question was more than one thing. It was an offering of agency dressed as protection.
She had years of practice at saying yes when she meant no. Tonight, she wanted to choose otherwise. "No," she said. "Not here." He leaned back as if he'd been given instructions. The decision to give her that room was in itself a gift. People stilled around them as if they were watching an intimate act broadcast through a crowd. If power had a quiet face, it was the one Minjin wore. Cool, studied, a control that didn't demand applause. Marcus, whose appetite for spectacle was now thin as a wafer, circled as if looking for backup recruits. He didn't know who Minjin was in the ledger of the world. He had made assumptions, like so many men who imagine their own lives to be the center of everyone's plot. A woman recorded the exchange with a trembling laugh. Another man posted a question online. Who was the woman? There was a childish delight in the crowd's small cruelty, the sort that comes when a person's fall confirms people's selfish need to feel superior. Amara pressed her fingers to her side. In the slight pressure of the wound, she found a lineage. The woman she had once been, moving through shelters and cold city nights. The teacher who told her students that sometimes you have to keep going because your future self is asking you to endure. The woman who had loved a man who left and survived. The crowd's eyes were flattering and dangerous all at once. "Please," Minjin said softly, and his voice under the holiday lights said two things at once. "You deserve better, and I will let you decide how better looks." It was a small mercy that meant everything. Amara let her chin drop, the posture of someone who had learned the difference between being defended and being infantilized. She would not be saved by hands that refused to respect her choices. "You wanted to pick a swatch," Minjin said softly, and the memory offered as a bridge, a blue for the fundraiser. Amara smiled, a fragile arc. "You remembered." He had a way of translating the small things into signals of care. When he stood, he wore neutrality, and when he looked at Marcus, there was an assessment, an almost clinical curiosity. "Stay," he told Jean and Taiyang, and the men took positions like flags unfurled. They did not push people or break lights. They simply occupied the room in a way that made it hard for an assailant to feel unobserved. Amara watched the security cameras, the tiny black dots that had become witnesses to everything. Someone in a corner was already retweeting a clip, placing it on a timeline like a coin in a fountain. The crowd's appetite for story had been fed. The next morning's news cycle would chew on armbands and whether a woman had the right to wear whatever she wanted. The sensation of being made into a lesson felt old as the earth. Minjin took her hand, not in a clamp but in a handshake between people who recognize a shared labor. "Do you want to leave?" he asked. She thought of all the nights she'd waited for a morning that never came.
She thought of Keisha's brash list of remedies, and of the child she had never held. She thought, absurdly, of phoenixes, of a symbol someone gave her in a moment where she had to insist on rising. But tonight, the rising was small. The choice of whether to walk away and let the story be someone else's entertainment, or to let the story force them both into a public theater neither had sought. The question wasn't whether they could burn a city for the sake of a slight. It was whether the city would respond with the kind of justice that mends more than it breaks. "Not yet," she said. "I need to do what I came for." He studied her for a moment longer, as if memorizing where she placed her bravery. He let his hand rest against hers, and then folded it away, the small ritual of consent completed. There was the inevitable swirl of reactions. A group of teenagers made jokes. An older woman muttered that behavior like that was why the world had gotten strange. No one paid attention to the way Amara smiled to herself, an inward curve that had nothing to do with the cameras. In the security office, which smelled of lemon sanitizer and the reheated coffee of a man near the end of his shift, the footage played. There, off to the side, Marcus's past could be glimpsed in a way his performance could not erase. He was nice in public, he donated at ceremonies, he smiled in campaign photos. That kind of sheen does not stop the accumulation of small lies that make a life brittle. Amara watched the images not because she wanted vengeance, but because watching allowed her to translate shame into evidence, into an object that could be handled without being swallowed. The camera's angle turned the world into something you could replay and study. Marcus's smirks did not look like the whole of him, they looked like gestures that had been worn thin. Her mind supplied the ledger, small things Marcus had stolen, names he had used, promises left unsigned. If a ledger existed for cruelty, hers would be full. Minjun, on the bench, wore a face that made no promises about what he'd do with that ledger. That uncertainty is what diplomatic violence looks like, a person creating enough pressure around another to make consequences inevitable without announcing them like fireworks. When Minjun rose, there was a small intake of breath from the people around. A watcher tapped his phone, fingers quick and light, already imagining a headline. Marcus straightened in his suit, the way predators settle when they believe they've been seen but not noticed. He did not yet know the difference between being observed and being accounted for. Amara met Minjun's eyes. He did not ask if she wanted the world to change. He asked whether she wanted to be the author of whatever came next. "Not here," she said again, quietly, "not in front of them." He nodded, and for the first time that night the world seemed to hold its breath like the pause before a verdict.
He moved with a decision that made the air around him colder without losing its composure. He would not stage a spectacle. He would use intelligence. He would use pressure where pressure made sense. He would, in his way, make calculus of things Marcus had thought would remain airy and untouchable. But no action was yet taken. There is a moment between intention and consequence where both people and crowds strain to see which way the scales will tip. The mall's lights continued to shimmer, and families continued to arrange their photos beneath Santa's staged smile. Cameras clicked. A child ran by with a cotton sugar mustache. Time, perversely, was both a weapon and a comfort. It allowed evidence to be collected and stories to be composed, but it also allowed the particular cruelty of a night to ossify into a rumor. Minjun stepped outside for a breath, and in the doorway made 2 phone calls in quick succession. His voice was low and efficient. The names he invoked were measured: Jean, Taeyong. He spoke to others in tones that suggested networks, not improvised panic. He asked for information with a practiced economy, for legal points to be held, for phones to be preserved. He did not shout. There was a specific kind of terror in the steady man who can make institutions take notice without threatening violence. Inside the atrium, Marcus recovered his composure like a man reclaiming a stage. He did not yet know the scale of the net being cast around him, the careful legal architecture that would, in time, separate his public smile from the ledger of his past. He had gambled casually on social complacency, and for once, the house did not wholly belong to him. Amara sat very still, feeling the residue of shame wash over the cleanliness of the marble like a stain. She watched the feed on someone's phone. Minute by minute, humanity organized itself into opinions. The comment section started to look like a battlefield of judgment, where the sharpest weapons were ignorance and quick sympathy. She felt the old reflex to apologize, to rug sweep, to make herself small so others could be comfortable. She stopped herself. A voice from the crowd, a man with an earnest face, asked if she was okay. It was a question shaped more by curiosity than concern. Amara let a breath out that tasted of smoke and resilience. "Thank you," she said to the man, because manners were a kind of small sovereign thing she refused to surrender. "I'm fine." She wasn't entirely. Inside, a part of her felt raw with the memory of nights without heat and the particular ache of holding a future that was first promised and then simply taken. But there was also a newness, a hard-won conviction. She had a man who would count the costs and refuse cheap theater. She had a life she had built that could bend and not break. Word spread faster than any of them would have liked. Phones would upload, people would comment, the shame would be repackaged in 10 different moralities by morning.
But for the first time in a long time, when her phone buzzed with the same name, Kong Minjun, she did not feel like a small thing. She felt like a person with a ledger who could, if necessary, convert pain into motion. "Do not post anything," Minjun said as he returned. His command was quiet but absolute. preserve the footage. The instruction was not an order to punish in a grotesque or illegal way, it was an insistence on accountability and record. That was one of his ways, to use the state's own mechanisms and social gravity where they could be used effectively. He was not a man who wanted to perform barbarity. His method was to gather light until the thing being hidden had nowhere to be secret. Amara felt the night settle like a cloak ready to be folded. There would be consequences, she knew. There would be a storm of public reaction, some vicious and some tender. But for now, in the mall's glitter and the hum of a child practicing the high notes of a Christmas carol, she sat and held the small interior knowledge that she would not be broken again without an accounting. Somewhere between the call and the decision, Marcus walked away to find his father, to script his responses, to practice apology lines that would sound sincere under a manila folder. He had not yet realized how many innocent hands he'd used like props in a play. He had not yet felt the slow crumpling of social currency that comes when people finally look and keep looking. As Minjun took her coat and draped it properly over her shoulders, Jean and Taeyang moved with a silence that had nothing to do with menace and everything to do with protection. They did not brandish. They merely rearranged the world subtly so that a man who intended to display humiliation would find himself, for a moment, under new terms. Amara glanced towards Marcus one last time. There was a hardness to his jaw she recognized. There was a man who had once been her story's main antagonist, and part of her desired nothing more than to see him undone. But something in her, honed by nights of loss, kept her from wanting ruin for ruin's sake. She wanted repair. She wanted boundaries to be enforced. She wanted the thefts remembered and corrected if possible. She wanted dear things returned, or at the least, for the record to show the truth. Minjun stepped forward and offered his arm. It was not a dramatic rescue. It was a simple gesture. It was a simple gesture. His arm fit under hers like a promise made of silk. Not a rescue, not a claim, but a way of letting the world know she had someone who would count the cost of her injuries and refuse to let them be shrugged off. They left the atrium with the soft shuffle of shopping bags and the brittle applause of a city that would soon move on to other public dramas. Outside, the winter air hit like a cold truth. Minjun closed the space between them and the curb, letting the noise of the mall recede as if it were an echo in another room.
He did not speak for a long beat. When he finally did, it was in that same even tone that had steadied her all evening. "Do you want to make a statement now?" he asked. Her answer was considered. "Not here," she said, the way she'd said it earlier in the night. "Not where they can make a show of it." He nodded. The decision to defer was not a postponement of justice, it was a strategy. He understood restraint as a form of power, the ability to choose the venue for the next move. Jean and Taeyong flanked them like nonchalant sentries. Minjun gave a tight instruction into his phone in Korean and then dropped the call into silence. There would be a plan. There would be evidence preserved, witnesses identified, legal steps taken. There would be a way to make sure Marcus couldn't rebuild the polished public face his father had helped him cultivate. They went to a small private clinic first, less to treat the bruise than to document it. The nurse was efficient, the sort of person who understood how to translate a body's story into a paper trail. A clinical note was made, an image catalogued. It was dry and bureaucratic, and Amara found solace in the ordinariness of that process, a form that read like accountability rather than theater. The nurse's gentle competence was its own kind of witness. From there, Minjun took her to a car that moved with the discretion of a thought. Back at his residence, the lights were soft, not ostentatious. The house smelled faintly of citrus and old books. Inside, the world rearranged itself into something slower. Minjun had Jean and Taeyong take positions at discreet distances. Their presence was a borderline between public scrutiny and private space. He poured hot water, and they sat with mugs that steamed like small excuses to breathe. Amara's hand cupped her mug the way she had learned to cup minor pleasures, careful, as if a scald could undo something. She did not ask questions she didn't have to answer. Minjun told her, piece by piece, what he had already set into motion. "I asked that all footage be secured," he said. "I informed the store managers that the police will be filing a report.
I made a call to an attorney we trust to preserve chain of custody for whatever we decide to present. No theatrics, only records. She listened. Sometimes the steadiness of his voice felt like a place to land. Sometimes it felt like a carefully constructed cage. Tonight, it felt like both. What about my story, she asked. If people twist it, if they make it about the wrong things. Minjun looked at her the way he looked at problems, not with indignation, but with a readiness to map out solutions. We will control the narrative as much as we can. We will present facts. We will give voice to what is true, he said. If you want to come forward, we will help you craft what you say. If you want privacy, we will hold it. The choice is yours. That word, choice, had new weight.
In the years when Marcus's absence had been a kind of theft, decisions had felt like wagers. Now she had a choice, and for the first time, she did not have to justify it to anyone but herself. She slept a little that night and woke to the subtle hum of people arranging their responses. The clip had already made its way across a dozen feeds. People debated etiquette like they were scholars of indignation. Marcus's small smirk was the primary subject of commentary in some circles, and in others the conversation turned ugly, about entitlement, about where women should stand in public. Amara scrolled without much feeling. She was not hungry for the outrage. She was wary of the flattening that happens when experience becomes a meme. Over the next 48 hours, a cautious architecture of consequence was erected. Minjun's team collected footage and receipts. An independent investigator compiled a dossier that traced Marcus's transactions, documented clients who had complained quietly in the past, and subpoenaed records that suggested a pattern of petty and not-so-petty thefts masked by philanthropy and charm. The key actions were lawful, privacy respected, evidence gathered, and coordinated with attorneys who specialized in civil exposure. The plan was to make it harder for Marcus to sustain the persona his father had funded. Minjun did what he did best. He used institutional pressure rather than raw violence. He called board members of charities Marcus frequented. He arranged private meetings with journalists who could not be bullied into silence by wealth. He handed over a file to a law firm representing several victims, women who had quietly suffered financial abuse he'd uncovered. He did not leak personal data. He let the documentation speak. Canceled checks, copies of correspondence, patterns of promises broken and debts never repaid. When word of these inquiries reached Mr. Wellington's inner circle, their first instinct was damage control. There were board meetings and the kind of corporate pain sincerity that comes with reputations built on photo ops. Minjun's approach made the Wellingtons uneasy because it was anchored in the law and in records. It did not depend on rumor. It depended on paper and testimony. They had never liked the idea of things being counted. Marcus, who had always believed in plausible deniability, now found a different kind of difficulty. People were beginning to speak in ledgered terms. Donors he had relied on started asking questions. A charity removal committee considered a review. A public relations team drafted statements no one yet published.
Amara refused at first to be the center of press cycles. She did not want pity, nor did she want cameras turning her into a cautionary tale. She allowed her lawyers to make precise statements on her behalf, a medical note here, a statement that a formal complaint had been filed, and asked that the mall preserve footage and that the Wellington family conduct an internal review. That measured, non-sensational tone forced the media to report in ways that centered facts rather than gossip. But the internet is a force that loves both nuance and spectacle. Videos of the fall circulated, but so did interviews with a handful of women who had once known Marcus in different contexts, women who spoke of unpaid loans, canceled plans, and the pattern of leaving when things became inconvenient. Some accounts were petty, some were grievous. Together, they created a texture Marcus could not smooth over with charm. Jessica Chong, who had laughed in the atrium, found herself the target of rumor and furious messages. Some defended her, others accused her of choosing to align with wealth against kindness. Her engagement photos were re-examined with a cold curiosity. Mr. Wellington, pragmatic and with a reputation to protect, urged detachment. He took his son aside, and in the private cloth of family, they negotiated explanations.
It was not a moment of shame so much as a negotiation of liability. One afternoon, Minjun sat across from Marcus in a neutral office. No cameras, no spectacle. Marcus arrived with a public demeanor of wounded pride. He did not expect the line of quiet patience he encountered. Minjun spoke in measured sentences, the sort of speech that read like a ledger in motion. "Mr. Wellington," Minjun began, "we have documentation of a pattern of behavior that your son's public persona does not reflect." Marcus's jaw worked. "This is about a scrape," he said, "a marketing problem." "It is about several accounts that have been mishandled," Minjun replied, "about receipts that don't add up, about promises that were convenient to forget." Marcus swallowed. He understood the basic mechanics of Minjun's approach. Pressure applied in ways that left options for restitution but removed the ease of a public gloss. Minjun offered a path, an independent audit, apologies were appropriate, restitution arranged with legal oversight. It was not designed to ruin a man arbitrarily. It was designed to take away the cushion that allowed him to behave with impunity. At the same meeting, and at the relentless insistence of attorneys who smelled systemic behavior, journalists who had been given sanitized portions of the dossier began to ask questions in public forums. The story moved from gossip columns into business pages. The Wellingtons convened, and in a show of corporate prudence, the charity board suspended Marcus's role, ending investigation.
It was not a dramatic downfall. There were lawyers and reputations and 1,000 gentle steps, but it was a severing of the mantle that had protected him. Social media, once an arena of shallow outrage, became functional in ways the kind of technology that had hurt Amara now helped. Women stepped forward with receipts and statements. A reporter coordinated a careful piece chronicling patterns of financial abuse, making sure claims were corroborated. It was messy, it was sometimes unfair, and it was never as neat as a screenplay. But it became a public accounting that Marcus could not simply laugh off. Amara watched it all with a complicated relief. She felt vindication that did not descend into triumph. She thought of the nights she had counted $17 in her pocket, and of the small daily ironies that had once taught her to shrink so the world would not notice the seams. She also felt sorrow. Humiliation, even when redressed, leaves a bruise, the scars of which no headline can erase. When Marcus sent his apology, careful, rehearsed, sent to her through counsel, she read it with something like a clinical eye. It was an attempt to stitch a public wound with private words. He spoke of regret and asked for discretion. The note landed in her inbox like a paper bird. She kept it for a few days, then moved it to a folder she labeled in a neutral way. Months later, when the petition for restitution had been organized and the legal steps were underway, she opened the message one last time and then deleted it without drama. Not vindictive, not cruel, merely an act of finality. Through all of this, Minjun stayed close but patient. He did not press her into revenge. He used his resources towards restitution rather than spectacle. He favored systems, lawyers, audits, exposures through legitimate channels over theatrical retribution. Yet there were weeks when the thing inside him that had been trained by harsher rules hummed quietly, a readiness to escalate if the institutions failed. It was a moral tension between justice as repair and the desire for the kind of retribution that leaves nothing to rebuild from. They argued about it once, late, over the soft clink of dishes in his kitchen. "What would you do if they refused to ask?" she asked. He put down his cup. "Then we'd make sure the story couldn't be ignored," he answered. "But it won't come from me burning a life for pleasure. It will come from truth becoming inconvenient for people who profit from it." She found that answer both cold and necessary. She did not want blood, she wanted accounting. She wanted policies changed, charities strengthened, restitution that would help women who had lost more than money. He offered a way forward that held both ethical limits and teeth. The weeks after the mall incident had another side, intimacy and mending in small domestic acts. A shower one evening, hot water like a slow confession, where Minjun washed the salt of her humiliation from her hair.
She let him towel her shoulders with a tenderness that did not attempt to erase her agency. In the bathroom, the lights were kind, not clinical, steam softening the edges of the world. They did not speak of plans or consequences. They simply tended to one another's fragilities, and the kind of gratitude that comes after a near rupture. He gave her a pendant a few nights later, a small gilded phoenix, its wings folded as if in mid-rise. "For the mornings where rising feels like a miracle," he said. The pendant was not ostentatious. It was a symbol she had once joked about with students when they asked how to lift a broken thing. She clasped the chain and felt for a moment like the woman who had taught a classroom how to start again. Minjun also gave her something far more concrete. He handed her, in a legal meeting, with a gentle flourish that had practical and symbolic significance, the deed to a small building in a quiet part of the city, an old community center that needed repair. It was not a palace.
It was a place of thresholds and leaky pipes and rooms that had once hosted after-school programs. For second chances, he said. Amara's throat tightened. The idea, an organized space to help women who had been financially abused not just survive but rebuild, had lived in her head for years in the shape of sketches and unpaid drafts. She had thought about names and program structures and whether she could ever move other people's pain into something useful. The deed felt like permission and raw responsibility all at once. It was a gift, but more importantly, it was an instrument. It said, use what you have learned, change the thing that hurt you. She accepted it with the strange humility of someone given a tool to build out of old ruins. I don't want it to be a monument to what happened, she said. I want it to be a place that undoes that kind of isolation. He nodded. Then build it your way, he said. I'll help. Jean and Taeyong handled the renovations with an efficiency that balanced respect and speed. Minjun insisted on transparency about the funding, avoiding the sort of quiet channels that had allowed Marcus's misdeeds. They hired a small team that included women who had experience in social work and in legal advice for survivors. Kesha flew in from Atlanta for a week and painted a mural in the entryway, bright colors of fire and feathers, while offering practical, messy cheer. Her laugh echoed through the building, half encouragement, half exhortation. Do not be the person who apologizes for being big, Kesha told Amara as she mixed colors. Promise me you'll take up space. The foundation, named Second Chances, did not appear overnight. There were permits and spreadsheets and the kind of bureaucratic labor that can be soul-sapping and soul-saving at the same time. Amara learned to speak shorthand to grant administrators, to advocate for low-income housing credits, to write proposals that made room for dignity rather than pity.
The small victories felt enormous. A grant approved, a counselor hired with the right temperament, Mina, the first resident, agreeing to move in. Mina was 27 and had the kind of laugh that folded when she thought she was being too loud. She arrived with 2 bags and a cat that sniffed suspiciously at new furniture. Her story was typical and not. She had been manipulated into signing a lease, had money diverted from her account by a partner who told her he was investing it, and had been left without a co-signer at the exact moment the landlord decided to raise the rent. She had nowhere else to go. Amara met her in the small kitchen they had repaired together. There was a kettle boiling and a tiny table where 2 women could sit without intruding on each other's wounds. Mina's eyes were quick and wary. She offered a small, practiced smile. This is amazing, Mina said, because gratitude is sometimes the first grammar of survival. Amara shook her head. No, your life is amazing because you're still standing. We're just offering the scaffolding. It was a line she used with the kids she taught and found again as she became a director, language that acknowledged agency rather than erasing it. Second Chances offered legal clinics, financial literacy workshops, and a small fund for immediate needs. It did not solve the broader systems that enabled men like Marcus to capitalize on charm and gullibility, but it provided something practical, a place to land, a process to repair, and a community that could teach the skills, the mundane economics of surviving and then thriving. On the day of the ribbon cutting, the building smelled of new paint and hot coffee. A small crowd gathered, friends, some donors who had been convinced by the rigor of the grant proposals, and a handful of local journalists interested in human stories that reflected civic renewal. Minjun stood off to the side, comfortable in the role of a quiet supporter. He had deferred the lion's share of the speech to Amara. This was her project, and that mattered. She spoke with a voice that was steady because it had been steadied by practice. She told a story not of martyrdom but of learning. She spoke about the thin juridical ways in which people are sometimes robbed of futures, and about how important it is to teach someone to count money again without shame. She introduced Mina, who stood up and said a few words about how it felt to no longer have to sleep on couches paid for by charity that expected the receiver to be grateful and small. There were tears, there were cameras. There was, too, a modest joy that felt like a collective inhalation after a long-held breath. Kesha recorded a clip that would later make its way online. Look at her, she said, pointing at Amara. Not just surviving, building. Minjun watched with an expression that was equal parts pride and a recognition that some things were worth quiet, steady commitment rather than spectacle.
In the months that followed, the foundation found its rhythm. Workshops filled and emptied with women learning to negotiate with landlords, to read contracts, to open bank accounts without fear. Amara sat in classes sometimes and taught adults how to make budgets feel like a plan rather than a trap. The work was ordinary and holy in the same way, a mundane set of tasks that, done repeatedly, altered trajectories. There were still consequences for Marcus. His public life unraveled in measured ways. Donors withdrew support from initiatives he had been associated with. Boards asked questions and, in some cases, removed him from leadership positions pending further inquiry. Mr. Wellington made gestures of distance that were as much about saving face as about moral reckonings. Jessica Chong faced her own social fallout. Some friendships frayed under the strain of her choices that night. Marcus tried private apologies and public statements that read like a man asking for clemency, but clemency is not owed to those who have not accounted fully for what they've taken. For Amara, justice had never been about watching a man burn. She wanted repair for women like Mina. She wanted the small things returned, the loans repaid, the lies accounted for, the institutions strengthened so that exploitation did not hide behind velvet ropes and charity dinners. She also wanted the world to remember that humiliation in public is not only an interpersonal cruelty, it's a civic failure when the crowd participates in the spectacle rather than in rescue. She found her own healing in odd, private ways. Sometimes it was the small domestic victories, a morning when she made a perfect cup of coffee and did not feel the urge to apologize for the cup being imperfect. Sometimes it was in the classroom when a child raised a hand and asked, "How do you get back up?" and she could answer without trembling. Sometimes it was in the finishes, a lease signed under fair terms, a woman getting her stolen savings back because the ledger had been made public and accountable. Months later, in a slow email that seemed like a way to tether himself to a past that had become inconvenient, Marcus wrote to Amara directly. The subject line was clumsy, an attempt at contrition. He spoke of learning lessons and of being sorry. There was an apology for the night at the mall, words about how perspective had been a teacher. It read like a man checking a box he thought would erase a stain. She opened the message with a clinical calm. She had, in those months, constructed a neat file of things that mattered, receipts recovered, damage paid where possible, a roster of women who had made complaints and seen some restitution. Her life was a web of such small victories now. Marcus's words did not change the ledger. They didn't return the hours gone, or the younger self who had had to hold a lost future and keep going anyway.
She read his apology as if reading the terms of a contract she had no intention of signing. There was no flourish of triumphant cruelty when she chose to delete it. It was a quiet finality, the kind of closing that has the dignity of being small and decisive. She tapped delete and felt, more than anything, a sense of release. On an evening when snow began to fall like slow, forgiving things, Amara stood in the doorway of the foundation and watched Mina and a group of women laughing as they untangled donated sweaters around hot cups. She wore the phoenix pendant, not as an ornament, but as a talisman that had become part of her day. Minjin stood nearby, his hands in his coat pockets, eyes on the group with something like gentleness. "You did good," he said simply. She looked at him and then at the women. "We did," she corrected. "They did." He nodded, as if that shift in grammar was the most important thing in the world. She had wanted to build not to be served but to serve, a nuance Minjin recognized and respected. Their life together continued to be one of mutual repair and negotiation. He was not a savior unsullied by moral grayness. He was a man who had the capacity to move institutions in ways that sometimes made him dangerous to enemies and sometimes made him a powerful ally in restitution. That tension never disappeared, but it was tempered by the thing that had brought them together, a shared refusal to let some injuries calcify into permanent silence. There were days when she thought about the little girl she might have had, about the absent cradle of that future. Grief did not vanish into the neat architecture of the foundation. It threaded itself through new joys and found expression in the work they did. When she spoke to a room of volunteers about trauma, she sometimes spoke of the long, non-linear map of recovery. "We keep the scars," she would say. "They tell us what we've survived, and they remind us not to let others carry the same burdens alone." Second chances grew slowly, deliberately. It did not change all the systems that had failed women like her, but it created small islands of competence and care. Graduates of the program found jobs or returned to school. Some reconciliations were messy and incomplete. Some relationships were severed forever because the cost of redress demanded boundaries that could not be crossed. That complexity, more than anything, defined the moral soil of Amara's work. Repair, accountability, and dignity, not spectacle. Years later, at another anniversary gathering for the foundation, a woman stood up who had been there in the beginning, Kesha with paint on her fingers, Mina with a certificate in her hands, and a small cohort of women who recited, in their own words, what it had meant to be seen and aided without shame. There was laughter and song, and beneath it all, a steady, unflashy pulse of life rebuilding.
Amara looked out at them and remembered them all, how the heel had connected with bone and pride, how a crowd had watched without intervening. The memory carried with it the sting and the lesson, now scaffolded into purpose.
she felt a gratitude that had the shape of a vow to keep building, to keep teaching women how to count their worth, to keep insisting that public humiliation need not stay the final chapter. On the way home from the celebration, Minjin slid his hand into hers. They walked under the glow of street lamps that carved small ovals of light on the sidewalk, the city's sounds muffled by snow. He paused and looked at her, the way someone looks at a map and then at a horizon. "You've changed more than the address," he said. She smiled. "So have you," she answered, in quieter ways. He squeezed her fingers and then let go, the simple punctuation of comfort. At night, when she unlocked her phone to check messages from volunteers and grant officers, there were always small reminders of the work ahead. Someone asked about a workshop schedule. Another offered a donation. There was one message she kept at the top of her inbox, a note from a woman who'd walked into Second Chances with trembling steps and who now had a job and a small savings account. Her message was brief. "I can breathe." Amara read it and felt something close to holy. The work had turned pain into motion, not annihilation. There was no neat moral tidy-up and no total victory. There was only the daily labor of listening and arranging and protecting. One winter morning, a year after the mall incident, she stood in the foundation's entryway and watched a child, one whose mother was enrolled in a financial literacy class, arranged colored blocks into a sloppy tower. The child knocked it down with cheerful disregard and then rebuilt it again, and Amara laughed, the sound lifted by something that had grown firm inside her. The phoenix on her chest caught the light, its wings seeming to tilt toward the small blaze under the coffee pot. She thought of the people who had once watched, amused by her humiliation. She thought of Marcus sitting in offices where men wrote statements about misunderstandings. She thought of the crowd that had loved spectacle more than rescue. She thought, too, of the small ledger she now kept, of names, of payments returned, of women who had the courage to testify. There are no perfect endings in the kind of life she'd lived. The city had shifted in ways both bureaucratic and personal. Some systems adjusted, some remained stubbornly slow. But there was enough change, and a network that would now ask harder questions of men who think their names entitle them to anything. On the anniversary of the mall incident, Minjin and Amara sat quietly in the back room of the building, a space kept for staff and moments of rest. The snow outside softened the edges of the city and made the world small in the most comforting way. He handed her a sealed envelope.
"I had a lawyer draw up something," he said. "You don't have to take it, but it's yours if you want it." Inside the envelope was a clear, formal document, an endowment he had set up for Second Chances, funds allocated for the foundation's long-term sustainability. It was not extravagance, it was a practical scaffold for repair. She held the paper, feeling the weight of both generosity and obligation. "I don't want to be carried," she said. "I want to be given what I need to do the work." "You'll have it," he promised, "and you'll make them earn it every day." She placed her hand on top of his. "We both will," she said. There was peace in that modest oath. Years passed. Second Chances opened additional classrooms. Some graduates returned as volunteers. The building's mural weathered and brightened like skin with lived-in hue. Amara aged into a leader who did not perform consolation, but practiced it. She still taught sometimes, because the classroom had been a source of clarity in her life, an honest place where she could see the next generation ask honest questions. She still received messages from women who had found their footing, and sometimes she had to sit through the ache of old grief when it rose like old weather. One day, she received a short email from a man she'd once loved, and who had once been cruel. The message began with a clumsy apology and ended with a plea for understanding. There was no request for reunion. It was small. It was clumsy. It carried no legal weight. She read it and felt the old tug of complicated pasts. She placed the message in the archive folder, and then, without fanfare, deleted it. There was a tidy finality in that act, an unremarked deletion that did not announce itself as triumph. It was a choice made quietly, like sweeping crumbs from a table after dinner. That act was for her a kind of punctuation mark. The story that had begun with a heel and a street performance of humiliation had ended, not with a grand burning of a life, but with the building of other lives.
At the Foundation's 5-year celebration, Mina stood to speak. She had a job as a case manager now and wore an easy smile. "We don't save people," she told the room. "We give them tools to save themselves." Applause followed that statement, not too loud. People have a way of understanding that some moments deserve restrained celebration. Amara looked at the faces around her, donors who had learned to be useful without making themselves central, volunteers who had given time rather than ego, women who had come in broken and left standing. When the event wound down and the crowd thinned, Minjin pulled her aside into the quiet that sits between tasks. They stood beneath the mural, where the phoenix's wings arced above the door like the punctuation of a sentence. "Do you ever regret not letting the city burn?" he asked softly. She smiled, thinking of the ledger and the small, relentless work of repair. "No. Revenge is easy."
"Rebuilding is harder and rarer. I chose the rarer thing." He leaned into her then, and it was not a theatrical gesture. It was a leaning that said, in an intimate grammar, "We will keep doing the work we choose to do." It was a silence full of contracts and tenderness. Later, with the office lights off and the snow like a hush outside, Amara sat at her desk and opened a small notebook. There were names in the margins: Mina, Kesha, Jean, Taeyong. People who had been part of a web that saved one woman's life and then many others. She wrote a short note at the top of the page: "For those who cannot yet count." She folded the note into the pocket of her notebook, and in the small privacy of that gesture, felt something like closure, not because the past had been erased, but because it had been recorded and rerouted into work that made a different future more possible. The city kept turning. Men like Marcus found their positions trimmed by records and public scrutiny. Some tried to rebuild in quieter places, and that was not her concern. Her concern was the women who stepped through her door and stayed. That concern kept her busy in a way that was rich and exhausting, and, in the best sense, endlessly necessary. As the camera of life narrowed to intimate details, Amara learned to live within the margins of ordinary offerings: a cup of coffee shared with a woman who had once been homeless, a new bed put into a donated room, the sound of small children practicing a song in the next room. The victory she wanted was not spectacle, but sustainability. She wanted the world to be a place where fewer people would find themselves counting $17 on an envelope. Minjin continued to stand beside her, not as a talisman but as a partner, a presence that recognized her agency and matched it with the quiet work of protection. There were complicated conversations about power and influence and the ways a man with resources could tip the balance of systems, and they navigated those conversations together, ethically, sometimes painfully, but always with mutual respect. On a late spring afternoon, a neighbor from the neighborhood, a woman who had moved in recently and who had been helped by the foundation, left a small bouquet on the foundation's stoop. Amara picked it up and carried it inside, placing it in a chipped vase that belonged to the kitchen. The flowers were not grand, only wild ones in cheerful disarray, but they brightened the room in a way that felt close to holy. She looked at the phoenix on her necklace and then at the women gathered in the kitchen, who were laughing as they cooked a meal together. The sound filled the spaces around the foundation like a warm current. It was not the end of struggle. It was a middle that felt enough like a new start to matter.
Some nights, she still woke at odd hours with a flashback, an image of marble, a heel strike, and she would breathe through it, naming the detail, and finding that the naming made the memory less monstrous. She would roll over in bed, find Minjin's hand, and feel the safe presence of someone who did not try to make the past disappear, but instead stood beside her as she built forward. In the quiet of those mornings, she sometimes whispered the names of the women she had met and the children who now had new books. It was a prayer that was neither spiritualistic nor theatrical, simply a list of commitments. Amara had been humiliated at a mall on a night bright with fake snow. That humiliation had been a public act, and the public had watched. But what followed was not a single dramatic retribution. It was a long series of choices: to document, to litigate where necessary, to build institutions that teach and protect, and to offer a community for the rebuilding of lives. She had found a justice that was not a spectacle, but a stubborn, everyday practice. When someone later asked whether marrying the man the world called a mafia boss had complicated her life, she would smile carefully. "It's complicated," she would say,
But the complication is less about glamour and more about moral choices. He was a resource and a partner. He also forced me to sit with ethical questions I would have preferred to avoid. That conversation is ongoing. People liked the shorthand, wife of a powerful man, and assumed a tidy narrative. The truth was less tidy and far more human. A woman who had been hurt, who had been protected and not patronized, who had chosen work over spectacle, who taught women how to count again. Years later, when the foundation had 4 locations and a small but solid network of community partners, a reporter asked Amara what she would say to people who believed public shaming was the only way to achieve justice. She paused, because questions about morality deserve pauses. "Shame is easy," she said finally. "Repair is hard. Repair requires accountability, resources, and honesty. If we spend all our energy watching people fall, we forget to build the ladders that help them climb. I want ladders." The reporter scribbled, and the phrase made its way into an article that did not go viral, but touched enough readers to encourage donations that covered another community legal clinic. That is how small changes add up, not with fireworks, but with a series of practical shifts. On a crisp morning, as Amara closed the foundation's doors, she noticed a solitary envelope slid under the office door. The handwriting was unfamiliar but neat. Inside, in a single sheet, Marcus offered a last apology and a request for clemency. He wrote of learning and of wanting to be a better man. She read it and felt the same neutral closure she had felt months before. She folded the letter, put it into a file labeled past, and returned to the work at hand.
In the life that followed, Amara kept the phoenix pendant tucked under her collar, a private emblem of rising. She taught, she organized, she repaired. She loved in a way that was mutual and demanding of boundaries. The mall incident had been a hinge, not a conclusion. It pushed her into debates about equality, dignity, and the mundane tools necessary for survival. It taught her that the city could be a place of cruelty or a place of repair, depending on the choices people made. The city, in turn, learned to look a little more carefully. Maybe it was the dossier. Maybe it was the women who told their stories. Maybe it was the steadfast pressure of lawyers and the quiet insistence of people like Minjun who used institutions rather than demolition. Whatever the mix, fewer men could rely on the cushion that Marcus once had. That was not a utopia, it was a small shift. It was enough. As snow began to fall again, soft and deliberate, Amara stood by the window of the foundation and watched the city blur into something softer. She raised her hand as if in benediction to a world she wanted to keep changing. The sound of laughter from the kitchen warmed the room. There was work to do. There was also a life that had learned to carry both pain and purpose in the same chest. If you enjoyed this cinematic story of survival, quiet strength, and the complexity of love and justice, like and subscribe for more. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Amara's place?